Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is, wherever you are, welcome to the Good Values Podcast. In this series, I'm hoping to talk to and discuss certain ideas and concepts with a range of different artists and creative people, as well as doing some solo episodes to discuss what I consider to be good values. Now, this will cover ethically right and wrong on certain issues and the grey areas between the two, but also the values that you use to make art. So the lights, the darks, and the in-betweens. These types of things are a conversation that I like to have with people and artists so that I can learn things from other people and I can try to share with others what my ideas and what I've learned about values. This can be something where some people reject the idea of good values, and it seems to be something which is subjective, which is to say from person to person it varies, and no two people will have the same values, and with others they will agree upon a certain concept of an objective value system, which is to say whether we're talking about ethics or about rendering, values will be generally following an ideal. This isn't something which I think is a taboo subject, but it can be a bit challenging depending on how people view the evaluation of morals, ethics, or sensibilities. I've found that people who I've met have really jarred with my ethical system, and I found it difficult to navigate around some people's way of conducting business. But that's something which is just a reality. Whether you're in the business world or in school or at home or among friends, you can find conflict where you wouldn't expect it. Likewise, when you're creating art, whether it's a drawing or a painting, you can also find it difficult to establish how to reconcile the values of an image if you don't have a preconceived ideal for a piece that you're working on. And others have a formula where it will be consistent. They'll always try to have a certain amount of heightened values, and others which fade into the background or the periphery of the subject. Now, to separate the two so that I'm not always doing both sides of moral and ethical and then art creation, I will begin to talk about each one individually. So, with regards to how to conduct yourself in the world, I don't think it's too preachy or unreasonable to consider basically being quite considerate of others, to make sure that you're not harming others with your actions. You're not damaging someone else's property when you're moving around. And that seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's been quite quite an eye-opening experience to realise that those who are a bit more inconsiderate of others, things and space don't seem to, get acknowledged or recognised for how damaging and unfair that can be. They can even strive where others who are more considerate won't. It's a strange thing to witness, whether it's second-hand or a first-person experience. And what I consider to be good values is to still conduct yourself in a fair and reasonable way, regardless of whether it's occurred to you or to others. To try to represent the ideals that you share with those who aim to be considerate without damaging those who have betrayed those ideals. You never want to appear malicious or try to harm other people, even if they've done harm to you or others. What I consider good values is to try and find a compromise so that it's not revenge, which is never truly just. It may feel good at the time to pursue vengeance, but in reality, the outcome won't be justified. It will never rectify the situation. Balance won't be restored by enacting vengeance. At the time it may seem righteous, but ultimately it's selfish and self-important. So, in the spirit of that, I try to make an example of, or set an example, I should say, of how I navigate certain incidents. When it affects other people, and you've witnessed it either at the moment that it occurs or after the fact through testimony, that can have a severe effect on you, even if it's not in real time. It depends how receptive you are to the suffering of others. If you see someone hurting and that impacts you, then you will be inclined to get involved to some extent. And how you do that will determine how you're treated. Now, that's not to say that you'll be treated fairly if you make the right decisions. Sometimes that's just unavoidable, that you will be rejected for trying to mediate or trying to have certain problems recognized by an authority. This is something which I have found difficult. The temptation is to speculate on the motivation of the authority, whether they are somehow intertwined with the guilty party, or what we could consider to be the guilty party, those who are inflicting harm on others. You wonder, are they related to or friends with the authority and therefore given preferential treatment? But that is ultimately unproductive. Speculation is only that. Unless you can back it up with any kind of evidence, then you are only telling yourself a story and spinning a narrative to try and make sense of why you're not being heard and why things aren't being fixed when they're being broken. So the best thing to do is to treat speculation as a distraction, a consideration, but not one which you will really factor in unless it is backed up by something a bit more solid. So instead, the best you can do is to try to represent yourself and others in the most responsible way you can. I've learned that the best way to do this is to put it in writing, not in a real indignant, you don't want to sound at the end of your tether. You don't want to sound too frustrated or impatient. You want to sound fair and balanced, but to have it in writing, because that is a record of an attempt and an effort to try to fix something, a situation, a problem, an issue. If you put it in writing, there's very little that can be done to deny it. Whereas if you just speak to somebody in person and it's not backed up by anything in writing, then they can deny the meeting or the content of the meeting. This all sounds a bit paranoid, perhaps, that they can deny it. Why wouldn't you give them the benefit of the doubt that they won't? It's something where if you put something down in writing, then that can't be misrepresented. It's written, and the interpretation of that writing can potentially be up for question, but only to a certain extent. Whereas the contents of a meeting where you've spoken with someone and it's not been recorded, that can be called into question and interpreted in different ways, and denial can be made. You could misremember things as well. If we're going to be as charitable as possible, your recollection of a meeting or an interaction might be skewed by your emotions. And you may be certain that it isn't, but unless you have it recorded either on video or in writing in an email, then you are remembering something, and somebody else may remember it differently. And memory isn't perfect. So, in my experience, it's always best to try to get things recorded somewhere or other. That way you have an accurate representation of what's been said and done. Now, even when you have that, you may find certain barriers and instances where you can't have your case viewed fairly. Perhaps the recordings aren't written, they are audio or video recordings. And on occasion, you'll be told that that's not evidence which is admissible. That only accepted evidence is emails or some other type of document. That's just a constraint that you have to work within. You'll be restricted and have your hands tied in some instances, and you have to try to do your best to represent what you have witnessed within those constraints. It's difficult, it's unpleasant, but if you lose sight of what you find important as far as treating people decently and having facts as opposed to impressions, then your case will be weakened, and so will your character. Now that's all to say a lot about ethics and morals and sensibilities. And I would say that it's worth doing things the right way. Let's take it away from the official and make it something where you don't have emails as contact. Let's say it's a neighbour. If your neighbour is doing something to taunt you or to just make the environment unpleasant, it will always be best to not retaliate. To try to speak to them reasonably, and if they're not interested, then to conduct yourself in a way which is respectable and reflects the truth of who you are as a person. That way, if someone is witnessing the behaviour of your neighbour, they won't then witness you retaliating or responding in kind. Because knowing the luck of how things happen, it will be on an occasion where your neighbour hasn't been witnessed instigating, and you will be witnessed retaliating, and you will appear to be the guilty party. So it's worth maintaining respectability and a sense of calm and fairness. It can be very difficult. It can be something where retribution feels justified, where you feel that someone just needs this and they'll learn. And it may be the case that they do, but it's not the way to do things. It's not a healthy society that we live in where we then fight back with unpleasantness or violence. So instead, maintain a sense of maturity and distance from the unpleasant behaviour. With neighbours, you can try to get audio recordings or video recordings, and you don't have to hold your phone up like that to get a video recording. Your phone can be recording a video and you can hold it down by your side. It's just anything to capture what's happening so that you have an accurate representation of the events. This may all be irrelevant to you. You may not be having any unpleasant situations in a professional capacity or in your private life. And if not, then I'm very glad that that's the case. But if it ever does occur, then it's worth trying to manage your emotions and to make sure that you don't escalate the situation. It's easily done. It's easy to feel that laughing at someone who's being nasty to you will be justified, but that's going to escalate the situation. That responding with some kind of clever retort would feel, I don't know, witty and worth doing to make them feel embarrassed, but that's not going to fix the situation. I would say, even if their behaviour continues, so long as you're not in danger, maintain an air of dignity and just carry yourself with a respectable distance from the unpleasantness. And I'll leave the ethical, moral and value judgments there. And I'd like to talk for a moment now about values with regards to artwork. This is an art channel, but I wanted to discuss good values with regards to the good and bad in the world. It might not be a recurring conversation. It depends. If something happens in my life, then I might try to discuss it in somewhat vague terms. But I think it'd be best to discuss artwork and how to approach it with regards to light and shadow. That's what values are. It's the light, the shadow, and the gradient between the two. I found that when I started doing drawings of people, I wouldn't add enough heavy shadow. I would have the light to an extent, but it would be too much. Depending on the finish of the artwork that you're trying to accomplish, sometimes it's easier to do a line work piece for a face, but then you admire someone who can add tone. And knowing where to put that and how strong or how restrained to apply this type of rendering is something which you do gain with experience, but you can learn from someone who's had the experience and can communicate it to you. And I'm hoping that on this podcast I can communicate certain ideas about values and the strengths and weaknesses of using heavy shadow or dramatic lighting to try and convey an image. Sometimes it's not appropriate to have really dark shadow, so that one side of the face is completely light and one side's almost completely black. That is going to signal something to the audience. Perhaps that it's a duplicitous nature of the subject. They are presenting one side of themselves when there's another secret side. That's what the use of light and shadow on, the two halves of the face has been used to communicate. So that's how people will read it. It's something called semiotics, something which I learnt about whilst doing a lot of reading this year. And semiotics is about how you read an image. And it's my philosophy that artwork was always engaging and powerful and appealing to me throughout my whole life by being beautiful first and meaningful second. And in the last few years, I've come to feel that modern artwork has really shifted towards the concept first and the beauty either last or not at all. And I think that that's something which I'm not quite so inspired by or engaged with. If it's too heavy a concept and it's something which you are facing the concept straight away and there's no consideration for balance or for light or for texture or any of the things which make artwork really appealing, then I don't think that we still have that quality which made fine art so powerful throughout the years. I could be wrong, but this is something which I've come to feel recently. Fine art was always something where it was grand and so well rendered and such a good understanding of how the world works and how things appear, that within those rules that dictate vision and interaction, there can be certain ways of manipulating the colour or the environment or certain aspects of the characters. And these things would then suggest meaning, and you start to read the painting. Something can either seem off or offset to the side or unpleasant or off balance, and it will take a while to read why that's the case, but that would be purposeful. And I don't see a lot of that in my experience recently, but I'm sure it's still out there. Now I'm hoping that that's something which people will become more familiar with again, but in my experience that isn't something which is being held up as a virtue of art making. It's certainly something which I value and that I look for in art. If I see something which looks beautiful, and the longer I look at it, the more I see, that's really skillful artwork. That's something which I think is professional and it's intelligent. Whereas if I see something which is heavy-handed and in your face and lacking subtlety, it's pretty rare that I find much value in it. Now that's again a value judgment in a different sense. That's something which is more subjective to my experience than an objective rule for the world. No two people will value exactly the same things perhaps. But when it comes to the values of light and dark, that can have a real effect on a piece of artwork. If you use dark in the majority of your piece, and then where there's light, there's a real understanding of how to balance the light and dark within that space to make it more complicated and suggest depth within the darkness, that's clever. That's really important. And it can be literally black and white, no in between. You can have little spots of shapes of white within the dark to suggest depth, to suggest perspective. And then where there's more white than black, you can put black in a lot more interesting and subtle angles and shapes and clusters in order to create points of interest where all of the piece is guiding you towards the detail, and that's where you'll look. But then the longer you look, you can venture beyond that intense detail to find additional notes of meaning. And that's what I mean by good values. Things which are well thought out, meaningful, and create an actual environment or an event. Something where a situation is being played out on a canvas or in a sculpture or in a performance. I'm not closed off to how people express their artwork. I just wish it were more subtle, more considered of the viewer. And if you add a grayscale between the white and the black, if you have a gradient of tone, of values that you can introduce, then there's a world of subtlety that can be added. These are things which I'm still learning myself, still trying to practice, and there's countless ways of doing it. You can use just hatching and cross-hatching. You can use rendered tone with a pencil or charcoal. You can use a chamois. You can use a brush or a palette knife. And colour is a way of using tone very subtly, very cleverly. And these are things which I think learning by practicing is only one way of learning. There's learning through teaching and practicing. You can read everything in a book about a certain subject, but you will have to engage with that subject in order to learn something to a greater extent. But then if you engage with something and you don't have the knowledge from the book, and I'm just using a book as an example, the book could be a person who's sat there with you showing you how they do this, or someone online who makes videos about how to do something, or some other way of sharing information, then your practice won't necessarily be backed up with theory. And I think that theory is really important. The theory is things which have been worked out beforehand, and it makes the practice have a bit of guidance. And it doesn't have to be boundaries which you can't cross. The theory can have limits where you go beyond those limits. But understanding the theory means that you can then make those decisions. If you don't understand the theory, those decisions aren't being made. It will just be a haphazard kind of stumble through this landscape. You won't know if you've broken rules or abided by them if you haven't learned the rules. And a lot of people say there aren't any rules. And I would say there are. There are most certainly rules about a lot of things. You just don't have to follow them. But I would honestly say that it's really worth understanding and learning the rules so that you can then practice how the rules work, why they're rules, and then when you can break them and what that does. This is how you really learn to be an intelligent, thoughtful, broad-minded artist, as opposed to a bit of a buffoon who's just shrugging their shoulders saying there are no rules. That's not a clever thing to say. That's just embracing ignorance. There are rules. You don't have to follow rules. But if you don't know or you deny that there are rules, then when you hit a brick wall with your production, if you find that certain colours just aren't working together and you don't know why, it's because there are rules. And if you only learnt what the rules were, then you could bend or break the rules beyond what you learn about colour theory. You can break rules, but you can break them better when you know them. Otherwise you might just be lucky. If you get lucky breaking rules, how would you know? You know it works, but you don't know which rules you've broken or why. Now, as I'm learning rules, as I'm learning how to make art, I'll try to discuss what I think is important about certain rules over others. Tonal values are rules that I think are really important. I'll give you one quick example. If you were to paint a woods or draw it, let's say you're drawing it with some grayscale brush pens like these. Some of these are darker, some are lighter. What you should do as an exercise is to take one of the darker pens or the darkest pen and draw some trees around the edges. And then take some slightly lighter and draw some trees behind those. And then take some lighter again, draw those behind those. And that will be values, tonal values, which will offer depth to your drawing. And by putting something dark up front and then lighter behind and even lighter still behind that, you've created expanse. You've created depth using tonal values. That is rules that are based on observations on the real world. If you're walking through the woods, or if you're walking down a long street and you look back, you'll notice that the buildings closest to you are darker than the ones far off in the distance. That's just how vision works. That's how the atmosphere and environment works. It's not only an observation by artists, it's a measurement by science. There's things which are just true. It's not something where we see it differently. If you see the world, then you see it the same. And it's worth applying these rules to your art making, because it will add a lot of understanding to your rendering. And as I said, you can then play with that. You can play with breaking and bending those rules. See what happens. But if you weren't to know that, and you had these pens, and you were to only use this to draw these woods, and you didn't know to go back over and over and over and over again on the trees closest, if you didn't do that and they were all the same tone, you wouldn't have that depth. You'd have perspective. If you understand perspective, you could do the trees smaller in the distance, larger in the foreground, but you wouldn't have the sense of an environment which creates the tonal values suggesting depth of an expanse. Try it out for yourself. Get something like a pencil or a set of pencils where it goes from HB to 6B. The 6B would go in front, the HB would go at the back. You may not even need the HB, but just don't press harder. Make sure that you apply the same pressure and you'll see the difference. The B scale on pencils is softer, so the higher the number, 4B will be darker, 6B will be darker still, 8B will be even darker, and so on. And then going to the H will be harder, which makes it lighter. So don't press as hard, because then it becomes silvery. But we'll talk about that in another episode. But that's just one example of depth. And I think that's a really important one to understand how the world works. That's a rule. You don't need to follow it, but you should really understand it, because then you can bend and break it at your will. So, with regards to tonal values, I would say that they are a rule that helps you achieve certain qualities and effects in your art making, that without those rules you would lack a certain sense of it is depth, really. Just with tonal values, it's depth. When you make certain things darker, it becomes deeper. So to sort of render my face, this is where the light is hitting my face. And there's darkness in the sockets of your eyes, especially on this side, because light is hitting this side more than this side. So you have shadow coming down this side of my face. These are all just realities of how light works. So it adds depth to your artwork. Anyone who understands all this already, I apologise. I won't be going through the absolute basics all the time, but it is just trying to reinforce the importance of rules. You don't have to follow them, but try your best to understand them and learn them, because they're there to help you. Some people would prefer to call them tools to rules, but I think that the tools are the instruments. The rules are how you can use those to the best effect. That's why I don't call the rules tools. It doesn't make a massive difference, but I think that to me it makes more sense with the concept of what the words mean. So yeah, values. And this podcast is going to try and enforce good values, because that is something which I think we all have the potential to enact, to be the embodiment of, and to share. We would all value each other greater if we would conduct ourselves with good values. It's only being considerate, sharing when necessary, and respecting people's boundaries when you acknowledge that that is something which they have. I hope you've enjoyed this. Sorry if it seems at all preachy. I'm not intending to be, patronising or condescending in any way. But anyone who is trying to learn more about art, values are one of the most important aspects of art making, in my opinion. Even with abstract work. Now, I'd say especially with abstract work. When I look at a piece of work that doesn't look like anything, but there are values, a scale of values, some parts are darker than others, and they're all put together, and there's certain slices here and there, and it doesn't look like anything, it's just art making. Values are important, really important in that piece. If you're unsure about the values of one of your pieces, take a photograph and make it black and white. That will tell you the strengths and the weaknesses of the tonal values on your piece. And then you'll know this needs to be darker. I might need to pull some of this back with an eraser, or next time I draw it, I shouldn't go so dark in this area. That's what I think really gives strength to artwork, is knowledge, a good critical eye, and an application of the rules with a freedom to bend and break them at will. All right. So I do have planned some guests, and each week I'll be talking to different artists and creative people, and let's see where it goes. But this is episode 1 of the Good Values podcast. If you do like it, then please consider leaving a like. Leave me a comment down below, because I've already started to get comments on my channel which I will immediately respond to, not only in writing but in what I produce for the channel, because some of the ideas that the audience have are great ideas that I really want to hear, and I'd love to make a reality for the channel. It's things which I might not have even thought of, so even if you think, well, it might not be a great suggestion, if you'd like to see it, please leave a comment. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I would ask you to ring the notification bell, just because if you want to see what I'm uploading, that will notify you of my latest uploads. My intention is to always upload 4 times a week. This will be an ink drawing on a Monday, a life drawing on a Wednesday, a painting on a Friday, and an episode of the podcast on the Friday as well. That might change in the future. I don't know whether it will always stay ink, life, painting, but at the moment it's been about a month that I've been doing that, and as far as I can tell, I'm not going to run short of those as a system of uploads anytime soon. There might be a couple of variations here and there. For example, I have art films that I've made recently, or in the past year, so, and they might be a themed upload for 1 week, where I might, instead of those normal 3 uploads, I might upload just art films for that week, and then an episode of the podcast, which will always be up on Friday. So otherwise, if you'd like to see a good amount of my sketches and ideas, then check me out on Instagram. It's SimonSays_artwork. And yeah, just support if you can. And I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.